Hello and welcome to a 2024 JJA Book Awards author interview. I'm Bob Blumenthal, here with Stephanie Stein Crease, author of Rhythm Man, Chick Webb and the Beat That Changed America, among 6 nominees in the category Biography, Autobiography, to be voted on by members of the Jazz Journalists Association, with results to be announced in May. Stephanie, it is a pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining us.
I'm really, really honored and thrilled that Rhythm Man is up for the JJA Award. I was just remembering a few days ago, after the nominee, that my first book on Gil Evans was nominated way back when. So it's kind of amazing to have watched the JJA grow, but just everybody else's books grow in these last 20 odd years. So I'm beyond honored. It's great. Thanks.
Well, you mentioned the Gil Evans book. You've also done a book on Duke Ellington,
Right.
And you've done a lot of editing. I wonder if you could give us a capsule bio of your writings.
Well, the Duke Ellington book was more for young people, and I really had a lot of fun with that because I really got to load it up with a lot of graphics and so forth. So I really enjoyed doing that book tremendously. Also ran around to a lot of schools and gave talks to kids, which was really fun. And in the interim, I've kind of done a lot of things over the course of my journalistic career, but also I was involved in the dinosaur age when we were going from analog to digital recordings. So I worked on a lot of very fabulous box sets of archival treasures, including the 24 CD set of the Duke Ellington Centennial edition for RCA. That was kind of a massive undertaking, and I really had a great time. We put out a very lavish, huge booklet. Now those things are like, wow, I miss all those great booklets. We all learned a lot, writing them, doing them, reading them. I also worked on a lot of other Ella reissues back when Verve was doing a lot of her early reissues of even Jukebox Ella and things like that. I worked on the Louis Armstrong, the reissue of the Hudson, some of the complete RCA Victor recordings of Louis. So I really ran the gamut of stuff. And of course, I never ever tire of the music of Gil Evans, who to me, it's like his music just goes on and on and on. And I've written about him in other contexts over the years. And I'd done a lot of work. I worked for a few years in the admin of the jazz program at Manhattan School of Music. And we put on all these fabulous concerts. And in a sneaky way, some of that is what led me back to Chick Webb, because we'd put on a lot of swing band retrospectives, deep in the pockets of Count Basie and early jazz material, but also a lot of contemporary jazz. So I kind of have covered a lot of eras over the years, and only, wish I was able to get out and hear a lot of more young audiences, young musicians working today. I'm a little behind today.
Your books have focused on band leaders and
Yes.
bands. Is that your passion?
Well, for Gil, it was also, I actually went to Berklee College of Music, also many, many years ago, and I was an arranging major. So Gil was more from the arranging standpoint. And the fact that Gil really had started his career copying the music of Don Redman and Fletcher Henderson and other big band leaders of the 20s, as he was forming a little band when he was in high school and college, he really had his roots there. And that kind of also drew me into a lot of music that I hadn't really paid much attention to. And then for Chick, it wasn't so much the band leader thing. It was really like other people had written about Gil, and there were small books, and other people had written about Chick. There's a wonderful small book by Chet Falzerano, who was a drummer and a drum historian, but no one had written a big full-fledged book. And for Chick in particular, I felt like here's this guy who was like so at the top of his fame with Ella Fitzgerald in the late 1930s. You know, they were the rock stars of their time, anything, hip hop stars, whatever you want to call them. They were totally in the top acts of entertainment in America. They had done a lot of breaking through the color line on the way, you know, but it's like they were cherished. And over the last few decades, it's almost like, wow, you know, the sands of time. It's like, what happened to Chick Webb? And as I dug into the material, and of course I saw Jeff Kaufman's wonderful film, but it wasn't the film that made me run out and write a book. It was more, you know, things kind of sneak up on you as an author, you know, they get a hold of you. And Chick's story, the more I learned about the drama, the sheer drama, you know, that he died so young and he was challenged by having spinal tuberculosis and being only 4 feet tall and all of that. But just that he'd done such a tremendous amount of creative band leading and, you know, kind of the kind of 3 steps forward, 15 steps back as a band leader, competing with all these other incredible Black bands in Harlem and New York City in the 20s, which is when he really started, and into the 30s. You know, I was like, what happened to this guy? So part of my leanings are always, how come we don't know more about him? You know, so it isn't just, not necessarily that I was doing biographies of band leaders. It's more like, what happened, you know? So my curiosity sort of drives me a lot.
It always strikes me it's particularly challenging to write about people who not only are no longer alive, but their contemporaries are no longer alive.
Right.
And in the acknowledgments in your book, you just the number of sources you had to reference and the research that had to take place. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your approach to researching a book on Chick Webb and the major challenges you faced.
Yes, they were considerable. You know, I often thought I must be nuts to do this because it was very, very different. Gil Evans, I actually got to know a little bit. I interviewed him when he was still alive. His family was very much in the picture. A lot of the people who were in his fabulous last freewheeling band were still alive. I went to hear them. So this was, I really had to, in a way, approach it more like a history book, you know, and an American history book, because a lot of what was tied up with Chick's life and career and musical career was what was happening in the country, you know, in the 20s, in New York, you know, kind of the jazz age and the beginning of modernism and the beginning of people kind of having the leisure to go out and dance. You didn't have to be, you know, a royalty to go out and dance. Everybody could go out and dance. So there was that, the opening up of American culture, of Black culture in New York City. But I took a few trips to Baltimore before, actually, and excuse me, I won't dwell on the pandemic. Thank us, you know, we all got through. But I was able to do a fair amount of research before things, you know, kind of shut down. And I also realized, since there was no collection, that's why I was so jealous, just abashedly jealous of all these other collections. Ella Fitzgerald has collections. The Smithsonian, Duke Ellington has. There was no Chick Webb collection. I was lucky, you know, to find a few pieces of fabulous ephemera through contacts and friends that I developed in Baltimore and also in New York, and just anything I could get my hands on. But I did get kind of documents from the city records, census records, and so forth. But the rest of it, I just kind of did a lot of pre-research, really, and spent a summer almost at the Institute of Jazz Studies, going through a lot of their Smithsonian Oral Jazz History collection before most of it was digitized. That was kind of the jewel, a lot of the jewels that led me into it. You know, hearing stories of people who had interacted with Chick, not just a little bit, but a lot, like Russell Procope, Mario Bauza, Kenny Clark, so several others. So I really plumbed the depths of that and from that collection, but also and other oral history collections at the New York Public Library, up at Yale, up at various places at Columbia. And the other huge source of research, again, I kind of got lucky just in the midst of timing, that digital resources had really exploded. So a lot of things that I found, especially about, it was almost like mapping Chick's early career through the extensive, now digital troves of archives of the great historical Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender in New York, the Amsterdam News, even kind of a gossipy sheet called the Interstate Tatler. So all of those kind of gave me, and of course the Baltimore Afro, kind of, I could sort of almost put together little itineraries as soon as he was a bit on the entertainer's map. It's like, oh, wow, he was really over here. He really was over there, and radio logs from across, you could see like his radio presence really grow just through looking at some of these daily radio sheets. Okay. So that was also an incredible resource.
Several aspects of the book, I think, are very important. And maybe you could touch a little on what were the key elements to you to allow you to present these themes. One is Chick Webb's place in the evolution of drumming and jazz drumming, and the resources that really helped you pull that part of the story together.
Okay, well, that, as you can imagine, was one of the trickier parts, being not a drummer. And in the process, it was kind of revelatory. So, of course, I went back to, Bert Corral's great book on drummers, which has a lot of oral history from all the greatest drummers. And those discoveries led me also into more deeply looking at people like Max Roach, who got to go hear Chick Webb at the Savoy Ballroom as a teenager. And he really talks about him so eloquently and how he felt like, Chick's technique was like impeccable. So I think what we have to really consider, I'll just try to be brief, is what he did. It isn't that there weren't other great drum artists already. There were, there was Zutty Singleton, there was even Gilmore, Buddy Gilmore, who was the drummer for James Reese Europe's fabulous Clef Club orchestras. And if you listen to some of his early work, it was so inventive because nobody had been doing things like that. What I had to really look at was also this transition of how drummers were really just thought of as the timekeeper in a band, to how Chick really put the artistry of the drums out front and center, and how, that kind of also went a little bit in the changes in the technology of the drums, because by the 30s, there were better metal parts, there was better machinery. So he took advantage of all of that. And one of the friendships that I found out that he had, which was just kind of, that's the love that I also hope I express, is just, he was friends with Billy Gladstone. And Billy Gladstone was the first percussionist for Radio City Hall. And he was also a drum inventor because he had to do all this stuff to compress all his kit and all his effects into this tiny pit that he had at Radio City. So apparently, all these guys, there were a group of them who Chick always sought out the best, the newest thing. He was, I kind of want to call him a gear freak. That's kind of part of the story. But I think the bigger part is that he really led from the bandstand. He was in control of the way the band sounded. He was not an accompanist. He was so much more. So that's really what I wanted to impart.
I was also impressed with the way you present the Great Migration, with Baltimore as kind of a way station to Harlem for so many musicians. These African-American newspapers must have been an invaluable resource for tracing all of this.
Yes, and they were from early on. I sort of started looking at, there was a renowned educator, Wilson, who ended up having a column in the Baltimore Afro early on. Like the Afro was one of the oldest independent Black newspapers in the country. And at first it had a different name, but he had a music column. So he talked about, he was a great educator in one of the famous Frederick Douglass High School in Baltimore. And under his wings came up people like Ann Wiggins Brown, who was the first Bess and Porgy and Bess, and people like that. And I just really enjoyed tracing these things because there were articles early on saying there would be no Harlem if there wasn't Baltimore in terms of the musical talent. Eubie Blake came out of Baltimore, Blanche Calloway, who I just really enjoyed digging into her history because I had known very little about her. And it's kind of like Cab Calloway learned everything from his big sister Blanche, and she also gave him a lot of professional help along the way. So that was fascinating. And of course, Billie, but she was, kind of younger than Chick, and they were sort of on different trajectories, but they all ended up intersecting in New York.
I mean, people know about Chick Webb's disabilities. And it struck me in reading the book that during his lifetime, maybe with the exception of Helen Keller, he was the most famous disabled person in the United States at a time when people would look the other way and not talk about issues of that sort. I also think that's a very valuable part of the book, but I wonder if it required any kind of special research on your part.
Well, I really tried to explore that as much as I could. Unfortunately, I was not able to get a hold of his files at Hopkins. Just the privacy things have changed so much. So that was really too bad, but I did the best I could. But another major figure of his time was Connie Boswell, who had polio and who, kind of flaunted her stuff by having a rhinestone-studded wheelchair. She'd just pull out all the stops too. And I just think Chick, it's very hard to put yourself in the shoes of the person, no matter how much you try. But what seemed to be the case for Chick was he had treatment as a child. He had a great pioneering African-American physician in Baltimore who ended up being his physician when later, as he had complications. But he seemed to have a blessed few years where he worked all the time. And I kind of think I came away with feeling like playing the drums is like running marathons every day. It had to have helped his health in a certain way, just kind of helped his stamina, helped his cardio, and that he was incredibly strong. And, most of the drummers too, who had eyewitness of Chick would just say, you would not believe what a powerhouse this man was. And that the way he set up his kit, that it was like he embraced the drums. He had everything all set up in front of him. But the heartbreaking part is as he got more and more famous, and the band's touring schedule was, insane. Really, they'd be in the last couple of years of his life. That's when I think his health issues really came out in public. People could see him, kind of getting carried off the stage, or having real problems. And he would always kind of carry a substitute drummer on tour, some of whom were quite prominent by the end. I know Big Sid Catlett went out with the band for a few weeks. So did Kaiser Marshall, who was Fletcher Henderson's. But what happened, the disease, kind of, it's almost, he had spinal tuberculosis, and the way it affected him really the last couple of years of his life was it affected his other organs. So he'd kind of have to stop, and just take breaks. But again, according to so many oral histories by the bandmates, it's like he just did not want to give up, and that was both the heartbreaking part, it's sort of like, did he really work himself to death? Well, in a sense, yeah, because they were riding, he'd achieved his dreams. They were at the pinnacle of everything they were doing. They had invitations from all over the place, so I think, he did the most as he could possibly do, as long as he could possibly do it. And that was Chick Webb. he just didn't give up.
So as soon as the Helen Keller comment came out of my mouth, I realized, oh, there was a more famous disabled person, FDR.
Oh, right.
But he went to great lengths to hide it throughout his career, where Chick Webb had no choice.
I don't know. That's what we don't know, because at the drum set, he wasn't. One of the interesting things was I realized in all the combing of every possible thing I could do and talking to all these other historians and people who were archivists, I never came across a snippet of him like at the microphone, where he was on the radio all the time. So you would think somebody would say, "Hey, how you doing?" You never hear that. So it's like once he was on the drums, then he was on the drums. I don't think he got up and walked around. He did not conduct from the drums. He drove the band from the drums, but I think it might not have been apparent really until he stood up. But what I also gather is he, once he really became kind of one of the top band leaders, even before he got more broad national fame, he was a hotshot in New York City, in Harlem. People knew him. He was friendly. He was exuberant. He was outgoing. And I want to say he was a tough band leader in the sense that he rehearsed diligently. He'd prepare for these big battle of the band things, like, as people said, like they were prize fighters. He was just so, we got to do this, we're going to do this, and we're not going to screw it up. So I kind of feel like he was kind of a don't mess with me in a way. So he might take all of his 4 feet and say, don't mess with me, kind of character, but also a really generous person.
Another important thing about the book, I think, is highlighting the contributions of some of the members of the orchestra. And one who stands out to me, somebody I always wanted to know more about, was Edgar Sampson. But I wondered, if I said to you, who are the 3 key contributors to the Chick Webb Orchestra, who you might name?
Well, Edgar Sampson was certainly one of them, as the band had gone from sort of Chick Webb and his Harlem Stompers, which was kind of an octet, which got bigger as it could, to a 12, 13-piece band by the time Edgar Sampson came into it in 1932, 33. And he was the arranger who I really helped just shape the sound of the band as it was becoming a small big band, but a big band, and wrote things that became almost anthems of the swing era. Don't Be That Way, Stompin' at the Savoy, the band's theme song, which is Let's Get Together, which you can't listen to without dancing, stuff like that. So he was great and a wonderful alto player. But the other person there were so many backstories I got into. So sometimes was it the contribution or who they became or the backstory? What did I fall in love with? But Mario Bauza, to me, was also a real key figure in the band. That came in 1933. And he went on to become, kind of the pioneer of Afro-Cuban fusion jazz with Dizzy Gillespie. And all of those relationships sort of started the Savoy, which is, to me, the Savoy was a character in itself in the book. So Mario's contributions, not just to the band, he was the lead trumpet player. He wasn't often so much the soloist, but he really helped shape the sound of the brass section, which was a big, fat, nice sounding. At its biggest, it even had 3 trombones and 3 trumpet players. So, Mario was amazing. And he was also kind of given a partly music director for the band, meaning he helped rehearse the band and so forth in his tenure. So that was a great part of the story to me.
There are 2 other characters. One is the Savoy Ballroom, and one is Ella Fitzgerald in her early years, who are key figures in the book.
Right.
You mentioned the sands of time before, and probably more people remember the Savoy Ballroom, which now there's a hospital, I believe, where it once stood. And Ella Fitzgerald then remember Chick Webb. Do you think that they've kind of crowded Chick Webb out of historical memory?
As I was writing the book, that was like such a puzzle to me. And by the way, there is Harlem Hospital up there, but where the Savoy was on between 140th and 141st on Lenox Avenue. Now it got torn down for a huge housing complex in the 1950s, which is still there. And there is a lovely plaque commemorating where the ballroom was. Ella, of course, is the real, to me, one of the greatest legacies of Chick Webb, and the fact that she lived so long and became just the icon of American song that she was. I mean, it's an incredible story. And I just think some of it also has to do with the nature of jazz criticism in a certain way, because even during Chick's lifetime, when he and Ella were, kind of coming up with the hits like A Tisket, a Tasket and things that other people, some people thought that, even then there was the, is this jazz, the is this not jazz kind of camps, and that some of that really lingered on into more decades later into jazz criticism in a way that kind of diminished, to me, in a way that might have diminished Chick's contribution, thinking, oh, he was so commercial. It's like, oh, give me a break. I kind of had to just put aside a lot of my own prejudices and biases about what's real jazz and what is not real jazz. And, people who could play Tin Pan Alley songs and novelty songs and meanwhile still have soloists doing all this incredible stuff on the bandstand. So that's what we think of as the great jazz of the era. And I think one of the other problems is that the recordings really don't do the band justice. They're 3 minutes long, they were dance numbers. So we really, again, have to just take the imaginative leap of being at the Savoy or being at some of these other exciting venues where Chick and the band and Ella played, and that there are thousands of people just eating up everything they're doing, devouring it and making a lot of people happy by dancing. So I actually think part of it might be that, just sort of.
One of my theories is that had Chick lived longer, he could have gotten out from under the shadow of the Savoy, just as Duke Ellington got out of the shadow of the Cotton Club.
Exactly, yes.
Once there were other ways to identify what he was doing. Right. Anyway, this has been great. Thank you so much for joining us. You've been listening to The Buzz, the podcast of the Jazz Journalists Association. This edition has been edited by Wiz Petta, with John Michael's composition Big Vic as our theme. We've been speaking with Stephanie Stein Crease, author of Rhythm Man, Chick Webb and the Beat That Changed America, a nominee for Book of the Year to be voted on by members of the JJA. The winners will be posted in May at www.jjajazzawards.org. And you can hear other interviews with nominated authors on other episodes of The Buzz. I'm Bob Blumenthal. Thanks for listening.